The message came through in fragments, broken by static and the low hum of failing equipment. No call sign, no rank, no operational code. Just a voice. Raw, strained, barely audible over the interference. In the background, distant gunfire echoed like thunder trapped inside steel. It lasted less than 10 seconds. But in those seconds, a man who knew he wasn't going to survive didn't ask for backup, didn't request artillery, didn't even give his coordinates. He simply said 6 words. "Tell my wife I love her." That was the last transmission ever received from the field team operating deep inside southern Syria, on the edge of an extraction op that never made it into official records. The mission was scrubbed, the site erased, the operators lost. But someone heard that call. A junior comms tech intercepting the final frequency from a surveillance drone that had already rerouted its path. The signal was barely strong enough to be recorded, but it was saved. Archived. Hidden in a folder marked incomplete. No one knew who the voice belonged to, not at first. But over time, whispers spread through the ranks, about a SEAL who stayed behind to protect a wounded soldier, who fought until his last breath, and who used his final moments not to curse his fate or call out for help, but to leave behind a message for the one person who still mattered. This is not just a story about sacrifice. It is a story about what survives when everything else is gone, about what a man chooses to say when he has nothing left to give but truth. This is the story behind that final call. The heat pressed down over the desert like a weight, dry, silent, all-consuming. In the lowlands of southern Syria, the sun wasn't just a light in the sky. It was a weapon, wearing down everything it touched, baking the cracked stone and metal debris scattered across forgotten villages and ruined outposts. Staff Sergeant Eli Mercer sat in the back of a dusty transport truck, helmet resting loosely beside him, his headset pulled down around his neck. The hum of the engine vibrated beneath him. Around him, his unit was calm, focused, speaking only when necessary. They had done this before. Everyone had. The mission brief was straightforward, at least on the surface. Confirm the location of a suspected weapons cache buried beneath the ruins of an abandoned compound. Extract any viable tech. Leave no footprint. The op had been pushed through in a hurry. Intel came from a local source known only by codename, and satellite imagery was inconclusive. But command wanted eyes on the ground. Fast. And Eli's team had been close enough to get it done before nightfall. This wasn't supposed to be a high-risk engagement. The area was considered lightly occupied. Old smuggling routes, scattered loyalists. Not much else. Still, there were always ghosts in these places. Wreckage. Dried bloodstains that never washed out. Craters where homes used to be. Even when the ground was still, the memory of violence lingered in the air like dust. Mercer checked his gear again, not because it needed checking, but because habit was all he had left when the noise in his head grew too loud. His wife had sent a voice message that morning. Something about the kids, a quick, "I love you," just enough to feel like home for 10 seconds. He hadn't responded yet. He told himself he would wait until after the op, when things were quiet again. He always said that. But the quiet was never what it used to be. They dismounted 2 kilometers from the target site, moving across open desert under the cover of daylight. No drones above them this time. No air support. The terrain was low and wide, surrounded by jagged cliffs and dried riverbeds. If anyone was watching, they would see them coming from miles away. But no one fired. No one moved. They reached the compound as the sun began to dip behind the western ridgeline. The building was skeletal, burned out, partially collapsed, its roof sagging like tired lungs. It had once been a warehouse, or maybe a school. Now it was little more than a shell. The team fanned out with quiet efficiency. Mercer set up comms in the far room, where the walls still held and the signal could bounce clear off the stone. He calibrated the link, double-checked uplink frequency, locked into regional command net. Everything checked out. The line was weak, but functional. He sent the standard pulse, comms online, awaiting confirmation. A green light blinked back after 3 seconds. Link established. On the second floor, the search team unearthed pieces of a reinforced tunnel. Empty, but recently used. Fresh boot prints, faint tire tracks, dust disturbed in ways that didn't match decay. There were signs of life, but no bodies. That was the first warning. There were always bodies in places like this, either left behind or buried beneath. The absence of corpses meant something worse, A setup. The kind of setup designed to lure, not destroy, to study, to time. They moved quickly. The sun slipped lower. Long shadows stretched through the wreckage, casting angular silhouettes that looked too much like figures. Mercer felt it in his stomach before he saw anything. A familiar tension, like a muscle tightening under the skin of the world. He tapped the radio, reaching out to the lead unit. Clear so far. But the edge in their voice told him enough. The whole place was wrong. Too easy. Too still. A civilian passed through the outer zone around 1700. Young. No weapons. Carrying nothing. Just watching. When one of the squad members tried to wave him off, the boy turned and walked away, expressionless. A test. Or a timer. Either way, it was noted and logged, and then ignored, because there was no protocol for what you couldn't prove. The team marked the compound, flagged the tunnel entrance for follow-up, and began the slow retreat back to the exfil point. Bravo Ridge, 2 kilometers east, through a narrow corridor flanked by cliffs on both sides. The road had been cleared the day before by another unit. Minesweepers had passed. Drones had scanned it. Safe, on paper. As they stepped onto the corridor trail, Mercer felt a chill crawl through his spine. His hand hovered near the radio mic. Something buzzed in his headset. Not a word, not a signal. Just a burst of interference that didn't match any known channel. He paused, tapped his ear, adjusted frequency. Nothing. The line cleared. The rest of the team pressed on, silhouettes long and distorted in the setting sun. Somewhere up the trail, the light caught something unnatural. Just for a second. A glint of polished metal. A flicker that didn't belong to the landscape. Then everything snapped. The explosion was immediate. It didn't sound like the typical IED. They'd all heard those a dozen times over. This one was sharper, closer, directed. A shaped charge embedded into the side of the cliff face above the path, triggered by remote or pressure. The detonation sent a wall of heat and rock down into the narrow corridor, collapsing part of the trail and slicing through the rear element of the team with lethal precision. Dust and shrapnel filled the air, choking out the sunset, swallowing the silence in an instant. The forward operator dropped with a cry, his comms blinking out before he hit the ground. Mercer hit the dirt instinctively, rolling behind a jagged slab of stone that cracked under the force of secondary gunfire erupting from both ridgelines. It wasn't chaos. It was control. Whoever was firing had elevation, distance, and timing. The shots were clean, short bursts from well-sighted rifles. Not harassment fire, not desperation. This was coordinated, deliberate. A textbook ambush, the kind designed not just to kill, but to herd. Eli forced himself upright, ignoring the ringing in his ears. His first thought wasn't defense, it was comms. He reached for his rig, checking the transmitter. The screen was flickering, cracked but not fully dead. He cycled through channels, trying to connect to the Overwatch link, but all he got was static. No response. No link to command. No drone feed. Just the short, sharp bursts of battle echoing through stone and the desperate shouted codes of men trying to regroup. The team had split under fire, half pinned in the basin, the other trapped near the lower shelf with no line of retreat. Smoke grenades were deployed, but the wind twisted their coverage, pulling it into useless swirls that did nothing to mask movement. Eli crawled to one of the wounded. Sergeant Downing, hit in the abdomen, conscious but bleeding out fast. He applied pressure with one hand while keying into the emergency net with the other. The signal blinked red, then green for half a second, then back to red. It was like the mountain itself was interfering. Too much stone, too many dead frequencies bouncing in the wrong directions. Another blast went off, this one farther away, closer to the fallback route they'd originally planned to use. They were being funneled, not just attacked, controlled. Mercer knew this pattern. He'd studied it during joint trainings with foreign special forces. A deliberate box-in-ambush with timed demolitions and controlled retreat lines. It meant someone high-level was coordinating. Not just rebels, someone with real training. His instincts screamed to move, but every exit route was compromised. The ridge was narrowing, each step forward pushing them deeper into a canyon they couldn't climb out of. Behind them, more charges blew, cutting off the path they'd entered through. Dust rolled over them like smoke from a burning building. The air too thick to see, too hot to breathe. Someone screamed for help. A short burst of gunfire followed. Then silence. Mercer pulled Downing with him behind a collapsed support beam, dragging him foot by foot across the stone. Blood left a dark trail behind them, lost in the soot and sand. With one hand, he cinched a makeshift tourniquet. With the other, he continued cycling the comms unit, searching for any lifeline. Command wasn't responding. The UAV hadn't circled back. The team's last known ping had been 15 minutes prior. And now, with visibility gone and location data scrambled, they were ghosts. He counted bodies, 3 down, 2 unaccounted for, 1 dead. Including himself, that left 4 confirmed alive, but scattered, pinned, possibly wounded. The fire from above had slowed, becoming more selective, as if the enemy was waiting for a mistake. Mercer used that pause to pull out the analog flare gun tucked under his vest plate. He hesitated. The flare would give away his position, but maybe it would signal a drone or any eye in the sky still listening. He fired it low, into the canyon wall, just enough to light up the ridge without creating a direct trail. A moment later, the valley glowed faint red. Then came the counterattack. Gunfire burst from the ridgelines again, tighter now, with greater urgency. The flare had worked, but not the way he'd hoped. They were being flushed. Mercer grabbed his rifle and moved. Every inch forward was earned in pain, the terrain shifting beneath his boots as if resisting. He reached a lower recess near the canyon's bend, natural cover formed by a sloped rock ledge. There, huddled behind a rusted sheet of metal, he found Private Ramirez, barely conscious. His helmet cracked, blood seeping from a cut above his brow. Mercer dragged him into the corner and braced his rifle across his chest, firing blindly toward the last muzzle flash he'd seen. One of his rounds connected. He didn't know where, didn't care, just bought himself another few seconds. Breathing heavy, heart pounding against broken ribs, he cycled the comms unit one last time. Static. Then a pulse. A flicker of connection. He keyed in the fallback code, identifying location and calling for emergency extraction. No response. He tried again. Still nothing. But the pulse was there. A heartbeat. He pressed deeper into the canyon, dragging Ramirez and carrying only what gear he could strap to his back. Every time he moved, the fire closed in. Every time he stopped, it circled, and yet something in him refused to shut down. He wasn't fighting for a win anymore. He was fighting to get one more voice on the net, to make sure if this was the end, someone would know it. He crawled behind a rock, propped up the comms unit, and set it to ping. Then he looked at Ramirez, barely alive, fingers twitching in reflex. Mercer took a deep breath and whispered a final string of digits into the mic. Unit ID, last known GPS, operator code. Then, as fire rolled again over the cliff, he added 6 words, the ones that would survive. And then he pressed send. Smoke drifted across the canyon floor in slow, undulating sheets, curling around shattered concrete and blackened metal like fingers searching for something already gone. The gunfire had quieted to occasional bursts, but the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was suffocating, predatory. Eli Mercer sat slumped against the jagged edge of a collapsed support pillar, his right arm slick with blood from a long gash that had torn through muscle and soaked into his uniform. His legs were caked in dirt and dried blood, and his breathing was shallow, ragged, controlled only by the sheer force of discipline. Every movement sent fresh waves of pain through his side, but he didn't stop moving. Stopping was not an option. The flare had bought them nothing. No sign of friendly aircraft, no drone overhead, no evac. The response he had received on the emergency band wasn't a voice. Just a blink, a flicker. Something that could have been a glitch, or could have been a lifeline. Either way, it wasn't enough. The connection had disappeared as fast as it came. Now the comms unit sat beside him, dead and hot from overuse. Its antenna was cracked, its internal battery drained. Mercer had tried to cycle the signal manually with a field tool, but every attempt had failed. The last thing he transmitted was that 6-word sentence. Simple, raw, final. He didn't regret it. If it was all that made it through, then it had to be enough. Around him, the world felt like it was closing in. The canyon walls seemed higher now, darker, leaning toward one another like the jaws of something ancient and slow. He could hear movement in the distance, the soft crunch of boots on stone, muffled voices in a language he couldn't fully understand, moving cautiously but confidently. They were sweeping, searching. They didn't need to rush. They knew what the terrain gave them. Time, gravity, control. And Mercer knew what that meant. They were waiting to find the last bodies, waiting to confirm the kill. He shifted his eyes toward Private Ramirez, who lay just a few feet away under the partial shade of a collapsed steel beam. His chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. Alive, barely. Mercer had stabilized him as best he could, sealed the wound, bandaged his skull, cleared his airway. But there was no morphine left, no IVs, no blood-clotting agent beyond a single dose already used. The private hadn't woken in hours. His pulse was weak but steady. If he made it out, it would be because someone had carried him. And Mercer was no longer sure he had the strength left to do it. He forced himself upright, leaning heavily on the metal beam for support. His boots scraped on the loose gravel, sending tiny rocks scattering into the void below. He scanned the perimeter again. The entrance to the narrow cave he had found during their retreat remained hidden by a spill of debris. It wasn't deep, no more than a few meters, but it gave him partial cover from two sides and enough concealment to buy time. It was a grave by every measure, but for now, it was shelter. He dragged Ramirez further inside, inch by inch, gritting his teeth with every pull. Each breath burned. Each heartbeat sounded louder than the last. Once inside, he stopped moving. Not out of choice, but necessity. His body could do no more. He leaned his head back against the wall and stared up at the fractured ceiling. Light filtered in through the cracks, a dim, flickering gold that made the blood on his hands look like rust. He thought about the first time he had deployed. How young he was. How different war had seemed then. It was sharper in the beginning, cleaner in his mind. Orders made sense. Violence had purpose. Now it was all blur and instinct, routine layered over trauma so deeply that he no longer knew where memory ended and reflex began. He checked his sidearm. 1 mag. 14 rounds. He placed it gently on the ground beside him. He wasn't going to use it unless he had to, not unless they came too close. His rifle was gone, lost in the blast, and the AK he had scavenged from one of the fallen attackers had jammed during the last exchange. He had no grenades, no backup, just the radio, the pistol, and a failing body shielding a younger soldier who had trusted him to lead. The heat inside the cave rose as the sun passed overhead. Time became impossible to track. His watch was shattered, its face cracked and unreadable. He guessed it was late afternoon, maybe evening. His throat was dry. The last of the water had gone to Ramirez. Mercer had chewed a corner of his sleeve for moisture, but it had done nothing. Dehydration had taken hold now. His vision blurred at the edges, and small tremors pulsed in his fingers. He knew what came next. Fatigue, confusion, collapse. He had trained for this, understood the symptoms, had seen it happen to others. But when it was your own body unraveling, theory was irrelevant. Pain became everything. He forced himself to stay alert by counting. Not seconds or minutes. Names. Every name in his unit, in order of assignment. Every face. Every call sign. The ones who had laughed beside him in the chow line. The ones who had died in his arms. He whispered them under his breath, letting each syllable anchor him to consciousness. When he reached the end of the list, he started again. Outside, the wind shifted. Voices came closer. Footsteps. He held his breath and gripped the pistol, thumb resting lightly on the safety. They were sweeping the canyon edge now. He could hear the metal clink of rifles, the low murmur of foreign words spoken in deliberate tones. They were professionals, not conscripts, not militia. He didn't dare move. He pressed his back against the stone and waited. One shadow passed just beyond the cave's mouth, close enough for Mercer to smell the sweat and dust. He kept still, every muscle locked in place. Then the shadow moved on. Silence returned. He exhaled slowly. Cut off from command. Cut off from the world. Surrounded by death. Mercer didn't know if rescue would come. He didn't believe in miracles. He believed in endurance, in grit, in the hope that somewhere, that signal he'd sent, those last words, had been heard. He didn't know if they'd find his body, didn't know if the enemy would circle back in time to finish the job, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not die without being remembered. The sun dipped lower, and the gold light that had filtered through the cracks above the cave mouth gave way to a heavier, more ominous dusk. Shadows lengthened like claws across the stone, and the temperature inside the shallow cave began to drop, offering only a brief reprieve from the oppressive heat that had lingered all day. Eli Mercer's breathing had become slower now, more measured, but each inhale rattled slightly in his chest, a subtle reminder that something inside him was torn, bleeding. His hand trembled each time he wiped the sweat from his brow. And when he pressed his palm against his side to check the bleeding, he could feel the warmth spreading again, seeping through the already saturated layers of gauze and dirt-stained cloth. It wasn't panic that filled him. It was clarity. He had reached the point beyond exhaustion, where the mind begins to separate from the body, floating somewhere just above pain, above fear, and into a state of absolute awareness. Every sound became sharper. Every second stretched longer. He could hear the wind whispering through the high rocks outside, mingled with the distant chatter of the enemy patrols still circling like wolves around a wounded animal. There was no running now, no repositioning, no further calls for help. The radio unit lay lifeless beside him, wires exposed, casing half melted from the heat of the sun and the blast. The last message he had sent had been the only one that mattered, and he knew there would be no reply. This mission was over. The extraction window was closed. Command likely considered them lost. Perhaps, somewhere far away, his name was already being prepared for the wall, typed into a file with a date, and the word KIA attached. But that wasn't the end of his story. He looked at Ramirez, whose breathing had grown shallower with every hour. Mercer couldn't tell if the younger soldier was still conscious. His eyes fluttered occasionally. His mouth moved as if forming words without sound. But no voice came. He was alive, barely, and somehow, despite everything, Mercer still believed he could save him. The idea was madness. There were no supplies left, no way to signal, no strength to carry him out. But belief doesn't need logic. It just needs something to hold on to, and Mercer held on. Because belief, not survival, was what had carried him this far. He forced himself to sit up straighter. The pain in his ribs flared like lightning, but he gritted his teeth and reached for the flare gun again. He had one shot left, one chance to create a signal strong enough to be seen if, by some impossible chance, someone was watching. He'd used the first flare tactically, with caution. This one, he would use with everything he had left. He crawled to the edge of the cave mouth, dragging the flare gun with him, pausing every few feet to listen, to rest, to scan. The sky beyond the ridgeline was streaked in blood-orange light, and in that fading glow, he aimed the flare as high as he could manage. His arm shook from the strain, but his hand stayed steady. He didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He fired. The red streak cut through the sky like a scream, arcing high above the canyon before bursting in a slow, spiraling bloom of smoke and light. It was bright, brighter than he expected. The red flare burned against the sky like an open wound, and for a moment, everything stopped. He waited. Nothing. No response. No aircraft. No movement from the ridges. Then something shifted. Not the sky. Not the enemy. Inside. A stillness. A release. Not surrender. Not resignation. Something deeper. This was the moment, the turning point, not where the battle ended, but where everything he'd fought for realigned. He was no longer clinging to survival for himself. He was no longer waiting for help that might never come. He had given everything he could. He had protected his man. He had sent his final message. And now, all that remained was the last act of defiance. To hold the line, to draw fire if needed, to remain conscious, alert, ready to take down whoever came through that cave opening, even if it was his final breath. His hands steadied. The pain faded into the background. He stared up at the sky, at the trail of red smoke curling slowly into the clouds. He didn't know if anyone saw it. He didn't know if anyone would come, but the flare was his stand. His signal to the world that he hadn't gone quietly, that someone had stayed, that someone had tried. He crawled back into the cave, settled in beside Ramirez, and placed the pistol across his lap. His breathing was shallow now, lungs clicking with each breath. The blood loss had taken most of his strength, and soon it would take consciousness. But even that didn't scare him anymore, because he had said what needed to be said. He had told the world what mattered most, and sometimes that's enough. The flare's smoke dissipated slowly into the evening sky, hanging above the canyon like the breath of a dying man. Red faded to gray, and gray to nothing. The light was gone, but the echo of its message lingered. Beneath the ledge, in the shallow embrace of shattered rock and fading adrenaline, Staff Sergeant Eli Mercer lay still, pistol balanced across his lap, body propped between instinct and collapse. His uniform was stiff with dried blood, layers of dust clinging to every crease. Sweat crystallized into pale salt lines that marked where the worst heat had taken hold. His face was pale, sunken, eyes half closed but never unaware. He had not moved in nearly an hour. Only his breath, ragged, slow but defiant, confirmed that he was still alive. The world around him had grown quiet. Not safe, never safe, but quiet. The kind of silence that lives in the aftermath of fire. The enemy patrols had passed again, further this time, voices fading into the eastern slope. He had heard them. He had marked their steps, but they hadn't found the cave, or if they had chosen to wait, to assume the flare was an act of desperation from a man already dead. Maybe they were right, but Mercer wasn't gone. Not yet, and if they came again, they'd still find a rifleman, not a corpse. Time passed. He didn't know how much. Enough for the light to vanish from the canyon, for the shadows to harden into the full weight of night. In the dark, the air turned bitter. Cold filled the cracks in the rock and crept under his armor, under the tape that held his wounds closed. He welcomed it. It dulled the pain, cleared his head. He focused on breathing evenly, conserving energy. His training kept looping in his mind. Triage, concealment, situational awareness, survival order. But at some point, the protocol had stopped being mechanical. It had become personal. Every movement was no longer about duty. It was about principle. He had made a choice not to die with his back turned. Ramirez stirred beside him, a low groan barely audible over the distant wind. Mercer turned his head, the simple motion sending shockwaves of pain through his side. He leaned over, checked the younger man's pulse. Still weak, but holding. He adjusted the wrap on the wound, tightened it gently, and whispered words he didn't know he still remembered. Something close to a promise. Something close to prayer. Then he heard it. A sound overhead. Not footsteps. Not voices. Rotors. At first, he thought it was another hallucination. The kind that had teased the edge of his awareness for hours now. Flashes of memory. Imagined movement. Phantom voices. But this sound was real. It was too low, too rhythmic. It was the sound of an American MH-60 Blackhawk coming in low over the valley. It grew louder, not just in volume but in presence. A physical thing pressing down against the canyon, like a long-awaited answer to a question shouted into the void. Mercer didn't hesitate. He grabbed the flare launcher again, hand trembling, muscles barely obeying. No second flare. He knew that. But he had one last tool. He activated the infrared beacon on his vest, praying the battery still had a pulse. The light blinked faint red, nearly invisible to the naked eye, but enough for an airborne sensor to catch if they were looking in the right place. He reached for his strobe, clipped to the side of his belt. It barely flickered when he activated it. But it flickered. That was enough. He crawled forward again, dragging himself toward the lip of the cave, exposing his position for the first time since he'd retreated hours earlier. The rotor wash grew louder, closer. Then came the searchlight, cutting through the dark like a blade of pure white. It passed once, then returned. Slower this time. Focused. They had him. The light widened. Then the second bird banked into position behind the first. He could see the silhouettes now. Door gunners, tactical crew, men with gear and purpose. The radio buzzed in his ear suddenly, static clearing for one perfect moment. A voice broke through. Friendly, command net. They were there for him. He keyed his mic with a hand that barely held shape, murmuring his ID, his position, the fact that he was not alone. They acknowledged. Ropes dropped. Boots hit the ground. And that's when the canyon lit up with gunfire again. The enemy had seen the birds. Heard the birds. They were returning for the kill. Maybe they hadn't believed he was dead. Maybe they just couldn't allow an American helicopter to extract from their territory. Either way, they opened fire from the ridge, bullets tracing arcs through the dark, glowing faint orange as they sliced through dust and rock. Mercer rolled back, shielding Ramirez as 2 rounds slammed into the stone behind him. Dust exploded. Screams echoed. The rescue team returned fire instantly. 2 gunners unleashing controlled bursts toward the ridge, while the ground team pushed forward under cover. Mercer couldn't fight anymore. could barely stay awake, but he stayed upright, shielding the younger man with his body as the operators reached them. He felt hands on his vest, voices calling his name. Then a sharp pain in his arm, an injection. Cold. Fast. The medic's voice told him to breathe, told him to hold on. He nodded. Once. That was all he could do. He and Ramirez were lifted out together, dragged, carried, protected. The rounds continued to snap overhead, but the birds didn't stop. They climbed, fast, high, clear of the kill zone. As the canyon fell away below, Mercer caught one last glimpse of the ridge, of the cave, of the place where he'd made his stand. The place where steel and blood had become the only language. Then the morphine took him. The last thing he remembered was the weight leaving his body, the sound of rotors above him, and the faint voice in his headset repeating those 6 words he'd sent through broken wires, now finally spoken back. Tell my wife I love her. The flight from the canyon to the nearest field hospital took under 30 minutes, but for Eli Mercer, it might as well have been a lifetime. His body had shut down in waves, first the pain, then the cold, then his awareness of space and time. He drifted in and out of a haze filled with flashing lights, gloved hands, pressure on wounds, the scream of engines and the sterile blur of fluorescent light spilling across metallic interiors. The field medics worked in silence, their movements sharp, methodical, practiced. They didn't ask questions, they didn't speak of heroism. They just kept him alive. Barely. By the time they reached the forward operating base, Mercer had lost more than half his blood volume, sustained fractures in 3 ribs, and had a collapsed lung. He coded once on the table, then again in the recovery ward. But he came back, both times. The attending physician called it impossible. The trauma nurse whispered the word miracle. Mercer didn't call it anything at all. He spent the next 13 days in a hospital bed, tethered to machines, fed intravenously, unable to speak beyond a rasp. His eyes opened on day 4. He didn't ask where he was. He didn't ask who else had made it. He already knew. Only one name mattered in those first moments. Ramirez. The younger soldier had survived thanks to Mercer's protection, stabilized by field care long enough to be medevaxed alongside him. The doctors told Mercer he wouldn't walk again without significant rehab. They told him the shrapnel in his side had come dangerously close to severing his femoral artery. They told him his recovery would be long, difficult, uncertain. He nodded. Once, then asked for a radio. The recording of his last message had been recovered. A comms tech had isolated it from a broken uplink, encrypted but still intact. 6 words, low fidelity, muffled beneath static, but clear enough. They were logged, cataloged, and, after a lengthy debrief, transferred onto a secure drive marked private. It was waiting for him when he awoke. Not broadcast, not shared, just preserved. When his wife arrived 3 days later, flown in under emergency authorization, Mercer broke down for the first time. Not from pain, not from trauma, from the simple truth that she had heard him. The message had made it through. She had received the call, played to her in a quiet room by a colonel with tears in his eyes and a clipboard in his hand. She didn't need to hear it again, but she carried the file in her bag anyway, sealed in a small drive wrapped in a cloth pouch. She told him she kept it close, not for the words themselves, but for what they meant. He had remembered her. In the end, when the world was falling away, he had remembered. Mercer's official report was classified. The details of the mission were buried beneath layers of red tape and operational silence. The ridge had no name on any map. The canyon was marked as terrain of no interest. The flare was never officially observed. The firefight, unrecorded. The engagement didn't exist outside a short paragraph in a classified incident summary. Team lost during extraction. 1 survivor recovered. Enemy engagement likely coordinated. Hostile territory. Recovery completed. No further investigation authorized. He didn't care. When he was discharged, they offered him a medal. He refused. They offered him a post in training command. He declined. Instead, he left quietly, no press, no ceremony, and returned home to a place where the nights were cold and quiet and no one asked too many questions. He bought a small cabin near the tree line in upstate New York, far enough from town that he could sit in silence without the hum of cars or the glow of streetlights. He didn't put up any military photos. Didn't keep his uniform. The only thing he hung on the wall was a framed printout of a waveform, his final transmission, visualized in sound. It looked like a heartbeat, or a mountain ridge. He didn't talk about the mission, not to reporters, not to friends, not even to his children when they were old enough to ask why their father walked with a limp, or why he sometimes sat awake at 3 a.m. staring into the dark. He only ever answered those questions with silence, or with a small smile that held more weight than 1,000 words. Ramirez visited once a year. He was quiet too. They didn't need to speak much. They'd been there. That was enough. Each time, they would sit on the porch, drink black coffee, and watch the wind stir the trees. And sometimes, when the moment was right, they would play the 6-second transmission through an old speaker Mercer kept tucked in a drawer. Just once. Just to hear it. Just to remind themselves it had been real. Because silence is not the absence of sound. Sometimes silence is memory. Sometimes silence is survival. And sometimes silence is love that didn't need to be explained. Only transmitted. Only received. Only remembered.